All right, we continue to look at previews ahead of the State of the Nation address. We're now joined by Economist from the Stellenbosch Business School, Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, to share her expectations on the address this Thursday. Good evening, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. So there are very few commentators who don't mention economic growth and job creation among the priorities of government that they need the president to articulate himself on clearly. What exactly would be your expectations on the economy, that he would need to delve deeper on?
So thank you so much for having me. And I think the very first point is that we have to accept that we are in a state of economic crisis. And by that, I mean we are not growing. We are not growing sufficiently for the type of development needs that the nation has. And we've been seeing worsening economic indicators. I think there have been some gains, but I think more importantly is the appreciation of the state of the economy. I think the appreciation of the need for improving productivity in the nation. I think the appreciation for, the need for us to bolster, labor absorptive sectors of the economy so that we can begin to respond to the labor and unemployment crisis in the labor market. I think we need to look at, we need to applaud, I think, and also look at some of the positives when you look at some of the commitments made in terms of some of the economic infrastructure gains that have been made with the transport and the Transnet. Let me focus on that one. The rail plan that has been put in place to improve operational capacities. And so you want to see some talk of positives, but I think mainly what you want to see is an appreciation that we are nowhere near where we need to be from an economic perspective. And I think that the question is, what should therefore be done? What are the economic strategies that need to be employed? And what are the new things that we need to see? We cannot be talking about what we spoke about, historically and the commitments historically made, because even if they have been met, which I'm sure the president will announce all the commitments that have been met, the issue now is impact. Are we seeing the impact in our society, in our communities, in the rural areas, in the townships, in our urban areas, in our businesses, in all the financial sector, all the sectors, not just the financial sector? Is the impact felt, and are we seeing the type of productivity we want to see? And I think we want to hear more about that in terms of what should be done.
Doctor, you speak about the economic strategies. Now, that is the part where we become more granular. We've heard that embarking on a massive infrastructure build project is the best way for economic growth. Treasury last year indicating that for them it would be embarking on this infrastructure build, but also greater focus on servicing our debt. Should these be the priorities right now? And which spending priorities would have to be sacrificed to ensure that we spend more on these two?
Listen, let's not talk about sacrificing, but rather what we must talk about is trade-offs. With economics is that you have a limited, or what we call a budget constraints, and you have to choose which is the best point and plan of action based on the deliverables. And so the first thing is, when you look at the economic infrastructure imperative, let's talk about energy. Let's applaud Eskom for getting us out of, the what we call load shedding crises, stopping load shedding as a norm. We were normalized into accepting, load shedding and blackouts. Productivity was hampered across the economic sectors. SMMEs, were held with high level of loss of stock inventory. Households, crime was worsened in areas, and all the effect from a productivity perspective, the loss of GDP, the loss of economic output from the loss of energy. I think we must applaud, the Eskom team, the board, together with the executives for what they have done by putting a stoppage to the norm.
But here with what has happened, I hear you emphasize that at some point, load shedding had become a norm, that perhaps what we saw the past weekend was no longer the norm. But nevertheless, we've had a lot of analysts saying that possibly we are going back to that era where load shedding could possibly be the norm. And this is just straight after the president had addressed the World Economic Forum, and when asked specifically if there were to be foreign investors in the room, why should they invest in South Africa? And he went on to, among others, mention that here we have stabilized our energy supply, which is critical for any entrepreneur or any business looking to invest in the country. But here we are, we've got analysts that are consistently, even on this platform, indicating that there is a possibility that load shedding would become a norm as we've seen in the years past.
I won't focus on them, but I'll focus mainly on the plans that have been put in place, the energy action plan and the execution of that, and how that has bolstered what we call the energy availability factor, and how they have bolstered EAF from all the weak nodes within the transmission, but also within the generation of power across the board. So I think if you've deployed resources effectively on the 6 priority Eskom power stations that were weak, and that has been done, and that has been enabling Eskom to come out. You have to pinpoint where the weaknesses are now so that you can make that effect. I think the second point on economic infrastructure is that the nation has really invested significant portions to try to bolster gross fixed capital formation. Now, if you continue on that trajectory and you link what is happening, with Infrastructure South Africa, with the infrastructure fund, and also with what National Treasury is trying to do, you will begin to see, incremental growth in terms of output. It doesn't happen overnight, but you've got to enable nodes where there has been what I call economic wilderness and economic depravity, and make sure that the implementation of our infrastructure plan covers those nodes, which are largely rural, which were largely the former TVBC states, which were largely, I would say, eroded and not necessarily incentivized and invested upon primarily sufficiently enough post-democracy. Economic infrastructure is very important as well when you look at SMME development. There's what we call value chain linkages. And if you just look at construction as one sector, you've got a whole value chain, not just of the inputs. If you look at a house, doors, windows, chairs, furniture, windows, to make it simple, all of these are manufactured inputs. Imagine if we looked at, generating a supply of people that produce these products, but also you create jobs. You ensure that the youth, those who come out of these TVET colleges, come out of university, are plugged into a system where our infrastructure is used in parallel to the labor market, in parallel to what is being planned in terms of infrastructure investment by the National Treasury. I can tell you we will see positive gains in the long run and even in the short run. So I think there are the gains, but I think with SONA, what you want to see is very deliberate massification of these so you can begin to see more impact.
Doctor, should there be an expansion of the role of the private sector in this broader infrastructure build program? Because many are saying, let's use the private sector's capital. If government doesn't have the funds, allow the private sector to help you build this infrastructure.
Allow the private sector to come on board. More so, give the private sector the room to have the appropriate instruments. So from a financials perspective now, you've got institutional investors, you've got pension funds, you've got lots of money in emerging markets and also in South Africa that is sitting looking at returns. But if the instruments are not appropriate, and this is where the critical instrument of I call the infrastructure fund becomes so crucial. What the infrastructure fund and also what National Treasury is trying to do with the agency that is trying to consolidate is to improve what we call project prep, is to fast track and ensure that the PPP framework in South Africa, the public-private partnership framework and deregulations are minimized, all the inhibiting factors. There's a lot of work that has been done on reviews in this regard. And I think that the government is on the right path, but we need to fast track execution, fast track, project prep in these areas and regions where these nodes where we haven't seen infrastructure, but also fast track the enabling environment so that you can actually quicken, the delivery of all of these mandates. And I think we do have an entity called Infrastructure South Africa that actually is setting these up. That has been set up primarily to do that, but we have to massify, some of the work that it's doing so that across the economic divide, you can begin to see those gains. So public sector cannot fund the infrastructure requirements of this country. It's never been done by most countries in the developing world. And so the private sector also has to collaborate, also has to come on board. When we create infrastructure assets and we create these instruments, there has to be a willingness. Governance framework and accountability has to form part and parcel of that. But there has to be a willingness from the pension funds, from the trustees, from those beneficiaries, particularly the trustees that manage and the investment strategies of these trustees. Many of them, by the way, the government employee pension fund being the biggest in terms of allocation of capital in the financial markets and particularly pension funds. If those could be geared towards, infrastructure finance, SMME or enterprise development, we can change the trajectory of our country. I hope the president says something about pension funds, institutional investors. I hope the president tells us more about how we're going to massify the good in terms of massifying finance. And I'm very excited to have heard the Minister of Trade and Industry talk about the National Transformation Fund. We need that fund. We need that fund financed as a matter of urgency. And that is one of the catalytic moves that is going to change the economic trajectory. I'm hoping to hear a lot more about that tomorrow from the on the 6th, rather, in the SONA from the president himself.
But of course, what makes it slightly difficult are also the political considerations that when you're speaking of a greater role that must be assigned to the private sector, then you have politicians that might say no, that would not be in the best interest of citizens, because you might find yourself commodifying or ceding that which is the function of government to provide to ordinary citizens, where everything is commodified.
None of them will debate it. Can I tell you why? Pre-1994, the apartheid government solicited state funds, pension funds, to bills, to Rand Water Authority, to Eskom Supply Commission, to the provinces. They understood that the state alone couldn't deploy capital to finance infrastructure. They built most of the infrastructure on the back of the financial reserves that were accumulated through savings. So instead of us using our savings to consume, which is a big mistake, we should be using our infrastructure, our savings, to invest them into future growth projects, future income generating projects, and economic infrastructure is one long-term asset that gives returns in the long run. So I don't see even all the different political parties in the spectrum. If these assets and if these products are designed appropriately with the considerations of the risk factors that the private sector has to deploy, and remember, this is people's money. So you've got to have governance framework and accountability and transparency. You've got to control how the monies are dispersed. But I think once those particularities and those significant issues are dealt with, everyone will benefit from this, both the private and the public sector, and most importantly, all of our society will gain. So I think that people will support these if they understood them better, and I think they need to be better explained.
Doctor, I can hear that you're a strong advocate for the triple Ps. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. That is economist from the Stellenbosch Business School, Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, there sharing her expectations ahead of the President's State of the Nation address this Thursday.